I'm Keith Kanoti. I'm the University Forest Manager for the University of Maine and the University of Maine system. I manage all the forest land those organizations own statewide. And this is risky wood versus safe wood. We're on the Penobscot Experimental Forest in Eddington, Maine. This is the research forest for the University of Maine, and I'm the University Forest Manager. The Penobscot Forest's primary mission is research, demonstration, and education, but we also have working timberlands that are just managed for timber, and that's what this stand is we're going to see here. It's just a regular, not part of a research unit, just a regular timber harvest that generates revenue to maintain the forest and for other purposes. So this is a pine stand, pretty typical for us. Was actually started out sort of mixed wood, pine, hardwood, hemlock, spruce fir. And the harvest we conducted was a regeneration harvest, a shelter wood harvest. So the goal was to regenerate a new pine stand. It was done in the winter time because of ground conditions, and using a cable skidder. Actually, this was done over the course of 2 winters. The whole harvest itself is about 35 acres. We have 10 acres right here that we're kind of looking at right now, upland. Then we'll cross a stream, and we have about 25 acres on the other side of the brook there that we harvested. This was a regeneration harvest, so the harvest removal was fairly intense. Removed in excess of 20 cords an acre from this stand, mostly hardwood, hemlock, fir, some pine, but most of the pine ended up staying in the overstory to provide seed and shade for the regeneration. Timber income is the primary goal of the harvest, but as all of our harvest units, we also consider other things. We've got a good example of a wildlife tree behind us. That was left, a cavity tree. We do have a brook crossing, so we've got an undisturbed riparian buffer there. Water quality is always paramount in our concerns. We had some established regeneration already here, so we protected that. So as in any harvest we do, there was many considerations. We started this harvest in 2017, and that was a big pine seed year, which is what we usually try and cut our pine stands if we can. So what we have here are 3-year-old seedlings. First year seed was 2016, seed matured in 2017, was dropped in the fall of 2017, germinated 2018, so it's had the 2018, 2019, 2020 growing season. So these are 3-year-old seedlings right now. We didn't finish the harvest in 2017 because we had to pull out and go to another site to get a research harvest done. We'd cut most of the hardwood out of the stand at that point, but we came back to finish it, cutting some of the overstory pine this year. So part of the goal was to protect the regeneration we had. We also have some seed this year, so we got a little more scarification. Hopefully we get a little more scarification to get some more seedlings in the stand. Another thing we did is we always have a lot of balsam fir and other shade tolerant conifer understories in our pine stands when we start that we don't really want. So after the harvest we did a follow-up cleaning of the understory, came back and brush sawed all the fir out from the understory that would have had a head start on the pine. So if you see fir lying down, that was basically unmerchantable fir that was cut to give the pine seedlings a chance to get ahead. Otherwise they would have probably shaded out the pine seedlings and our shelter wood might have failed. Remember, we did this with a cable skidder. Hard to make a living cutting 5-inch fir with a cable skidder these days, but it worked very well for the rest of the treatment. We have a good logger we work with often. So the instruction to the logger was cut any fir that was merchantable, any fir you could run over without going out of your way, run it over. But that always still leaves a considerable amount of fir in the stand. So we came back and actually did a brush saw treatment and chainsaw treatment to fell the remaining fir in the understory. We have a good percentage of pine in our overstory. We try and regenerate it. That's one of our focus species. It's valuable to us, and it's also one of the species that's useful to us from a research standpoint. So setting our stands up to have pine stands for future managers to work with is consistent with our management objectives. So we put a lot of effort into trying to regenerate pine where we have pine and where the soils seem suitable. We kind of take more of a landscape approach. If I push this stand to predominantly pine, that's great, but we're going to have fir right next door. So it's hard enough to grow the species you want where you want to grow them sometimes, so we put a lot of effort into making a pine stand a pine stand. And if I don't have fir in that, that's fine, because I'm going to have fir on the next 5 acres over there. And fir certainly is down near the end of its southern range here. Merchantability wise, it's not so great. Pine, we're more in the middle of its range, so if it does shift around a little bit, seems like we'd be in a better chance to keep it here for a while. And at least what I know about species and climate change is once the trees are established, they're pretty robust. I think the bottleneck may be in the regeneration phase, so if we can get them going and get them up to be mature trees or on their way to mature trees, that should give us some insurance against, at least for the near term, against species shifts. I don't think pine is going to die wholesale as mature trees. It's the regeneration phase which might cause us problems. This tree says brush. So our best management practices we use to protect water quality at this site. We've got a brook, which we'll see in a minute, and we've got a minor slope coming down to the brook. We used a couple of BMPs, best management practices, one of which was winter conditions, so we tried to cut this in the winter. The second of which was slash in our trails. We're down here in the lower Penobscot Valley. This area does not have very good predictable frozen ground. We can have rain at any time in the winter. We can have thaws at any time in the winter. So we try to freeze trails by driving over them, get frost into the trails, and pack brush into them. But one of the key parts of best management practices is they need to be maintained over time. They can get degraded, the slash can get worn out, ruts can start to develop. So one of the things working with our logger we did was, this was a painted wood sale, so we marked the wood. And while we're in here, we had some low quality hemlock that had a lot of brush on them, a lot of slash. So down near the stream crossing, I just painted brush on some of these lower hemlock, and our logger knew that, after we discussed it with him, that that's a tree that if you need it, you can take that and stuff it in the trail. It's not worth very much from an economic standpoint, it's worth much more as slash in the trail. So we designated some, we didn't put everything in the beginning, but if we needed it, he had some brush trees he could just throw in there. So the paint gun's a communication device, helps us tell which trees to cut, but we can also use it to scrawl some other information on trees if we need them. That was also available for closeout. When he closed out the site, if we needed to put some more brush in the trail to make sure it was stable and the exposed soil was covered up, he had these trees. So that's part of our planning process, is try and plan for the maintenance of our BMPs as we go along. Turns out we didn't need this one, so there it sits. It'll have other values, diversify the stand a little bit, and those sorts of things. So I was out here a lot because it's a high-risk site. The logger we work with, Roger Avery, we work with him a lot. He's been doing this for a long time. He knows what he's doing. Doesn't need someone looking over his shoulder every day. But the amount of time we spend on a site is sort of proportional to the risk of the site. This one had a lot going on. It had a stream crossing. It's got harvesting in the shoreland zone. It's got a lot of complicated regen protection on the other side. So it was worth it to me to be out here a lot and just check on things. If we needed to make adjustments, I could make it quickly, and we did before things went the way we didn't want them to. So the other nice thing about using a cable skidder is the production rate is pretty low, so the risk is lower just from you're not moving that much wood and moving that quickly. So that's an advantage of working with a cable skidder from a risk standpoint. It's just a slower operation. If this was a flat, low-risk site and we were doing an overstory removal and it was very simple prescription, I would have been out here much less. But it was worth it to me to drive out here a lot, just see what was going on and make adjustments as we went and communicate and work in partnership with the logger to get it done. So this is probably the riskiest part of our harvest right here, crossing the stream. We've got a major wetland upstream. This flows into Chimo Pond, probably less than a quarter mile downstream. Alewife migrate up this stream. There could be Atlantic salmon fry in here, so from an ecological standpoint, it's very valuable. So the first BMP we used was a streamside buffer. This stream has a legal 75-foot buffer on, which we're allowed to harvest in. But first thing was to plan out and flag out the buffer, make sure we had an acceptable BMP buffer. We chose not to harvest within the buffer. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, but we chose to actually leave this as a no harvest strip. Harvesting in the buffer is fine if you can do it without disturbing the soil and maintain the integrity of the forest stand. But we put a skidder bridge in here as our stream crossing, and we did that first thing during the harvest. So before we were even ready to go over here, we put the bridge in, and what we did basically was drag a lot of brush into this side here, which is pretty wet soils, pretty fine textured soil down here in the floodplain, so we knew this would be the riskiest part. It's a little better over there, it's a little more upland, a little better soils, so we spent more time on this side. Pulled some skidder bridges across and installed 2 bumper logs on the outside to keep the hitch contained on top of the bridge as we drove across. And then what we did is we started harvesting up on this side here. But in order to get the trails frozen, because again, as I said, down here winter is unpredictable, and we can't always depend on really cold weather. I marked a little, we didn't really have a harvest unit directly on the other side of the bridge, but I marked a little bit of wood along the trail, just sort of as a light thinning improvement. And what the logger did was every day, last hitch, he'd run over there and get a hitch and bring it back. And that let us start to work the snow, work frost into the trail, and start to freeze that. We didn't go whole hog over there, but we planned to build frost into that slowly over time. And that's what we did. And the trail we'll walk over here is that trail we built frost into as we could. Since this side of the brook is much safer, because we don't have to cross a brook to access this wood. The soils are nice, good upland soils, not a whole lot of rutting hazard. What we did, as soon as this side was frozen in sufficiently, we went and worked over here and saved the remaining wood over here in case we had a bad day. Those times when we get a rain in February or it goes up to 50 degrees and we didn't want to risk going across this crossing. We saved some safe wood over here, worked the risky wood on bad days, or on good days rather, and just kept going at this until we were sure we'd had it all done. Then we finished this last towards the end of the season. So that planning of what wood is safe, what wood is risky, was, I think, helpful in thinking about that. And once the logger kind of understood that and understood the plan, again, the communication, we really didn't have to talk about it anymore. He'd say, yeah, it's a cruddy day, it's raining, but I still want to work. I'm going to work up here half a day on this side. Another advantage of working with a cable skidder where there's some flexibility there, where how you jump around a lot. And again, once we sort of got each other figured out and what we wanted and what the plan was, that sort of happened automatically. He knew what to do and would give me a call if he had a question, or I'd give him a text in the morning, say, hey Roger, which side are you working on today? Probably ought to stay in the upland, and that worked pretty well. I think we brought about 350 cords across this crossing. We've got a nice intact riparian area here, lots of habitat diversity. I'm not a wildlife biologist, but we've got some openings, some gaps, some structural diversity. We got a hummingbird on a cardinal flower there. We didn't plan that. So a nice travel corridor that we left uninterrupted along the brook. The crossing location itself, kind of standard BMPs, look for a narrow section, hard bottom, hard high banks, cross at a right angle if you can, get through the riparian area quickly and out of it. The bumper trees are important. We tried to locate it with bumpers on either side to contain the hitch so it wouldn't flop over and damage the banks. And as I said, when we put these bridges in, we also dragged a couple of big pulpwood logs on the side of them, again to make some additional bumpers to keep the hitch centered on the bridge and not to rake the banks as it went across. And then we just dragged those out with the bridge and sent them in the mill, so we didn't lose anything from that. They went with the last load of wood. Things we looked for afterwards, looked to make sure the banks were still intact during the closeout. Look for any risk of any exposed soil within the buffer that could enter. That side, to stabilize it at the end, we dragged some of those brush hemlock in there, last thing, lopped them up, left them in the trail. It was less hay we had to lug in. Here we did bring some hay down, just to be doubly sure, and put some hay in the buffer area. The approach, it's pretty shallow slope. There is some slope, but there's enough natural breaks in the topography there. There's really no need to install water bars or anything like that. If that wasn't the case, we would have had to maybe do something different there, but recognizing the importance of having flexibility in BMPs, putting water bars in that probably would have done more disturbance and not any more good. So looking at the topography and being able to justify what we did there is why we didn't install any more diversion structures. The natural topography was enough. The stream's probably 15 feet wide and we had 20-foot bridges. I would have liked to have some that were a little bit longer, but it's what we had. Sometimes you got to deal with what you had. The good thing is we had some pretty rocky banks, so those set in there, and once you pack snow and ice and stuff around them, they sort of freeze into place. We didn't have any trouble getting them out. We were able to pull them all out with the skidder, put them in with the skidder. We chained them to the blade and drove up to the crossing and set them down across, so we didn't have to drag them across the brook. There's a technique for doing that where you chain it on the blade, lift it up, drive forward, and flop it down. So that's what we did for this. So we never had to drive across this until the bridges were in. Yeah, so this is the main resource we were trying to protect, along with the stream. The stream comes out of this wetland complex, heads down to Chimo Pond. So these are the resources we needed to protect, and this is why it was risky. We've got about a 60-acre wetland here and about a 10-acre wetland just on the other side of us, so there was this narrow little corridor we could sneak a skid trail through. But if you think about risk, you know, we got a water body on both sides, we've got to get across a brook to get here. That's why the risk alarm starts to go off and said, okay, stuff over here is risky, conditions have to be right. That's again why we reserve that safe wood over there for when conditions weren't right, because conditions tend to not go to pieces for the whole winter. There's good times and there's bad times. So being able to jump around a little bit and have some flexibility worked out well for us anyways on this harvest unit. You can't always design that in. Sometimes your equipment systems are limited, sometimes your ground is limited. But where you have opportunity, it's worth thinking about that. It helps you sleep better at night when you know you've got a good plan. And you won't have to shut somebody off and not let them go that day. You can stick them over here and they can at least stay productive. Well, the harvest was wintertime, and the winter conditions weren't great this year. We didn't have really good we didn't have a lot of deep cold to freeze things. So again, we had to use the cold we had to break down trails, get them frozen, plant our BMPs, use brush, those sorts of things. So during the harvest, we had at least this year, we had marginal winter conditions. 3 years ago when we started this harvest, it was during that December, early January in 2017 where it was 25 below zero for like a week. So that was perfect. I mean, anything can work that time, but we can't depend on that, which is why we plan in sort of safety mechanisms. We put brush down today, even if it's dry and dusty, because it's going to rain sometime. We freeze our trail because we know we're going to get that 50-degree day and stuff's going to go to pieces. So we plan that ahead of time because we can't depend on consistent cold, consistent dry for the length of time it's going to take us to do this harvest. We knew we were going to be here most of the winter. Drought can be a benefit for the harvest operations. If the conditions are dry, you can sometimes go places in the summer that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. If you want to scarify sites on a pine seed year, you need to disturb the ground, so having dry conditions is good. Although, again, in that regeneration phase, when these seedlings are sprouting next June, we have a dry stretch, you know, they may not make it through, so that's an issue. So there certainly can be impacts to certain phases in the tree's life cycle where that's important. Harvest-wise, droughts tend to help you out, unless it gets so dry that you got really, really high fire danger, and then there's issues with that. Not something we generally worry about too much here in Maine, but it certainly can be an issue. But You know, dry and frozen are the two times we like to harvest. So if it's dry, that means it's good going generally. Climate variability and climate change, it always has pluses and minuses. It's not one direction or the other. It kind of depends on the issue you're dealing with at the moment. It might be good for cutting wood, but it might be bad for regeneration, so that's always sort of a trade-off. Plan, maintain diversity in your forest, maintain diversity in your road systems and everything else. Just like playing the market sometimes. You have a diverse portfolio out there, better chance you can make use of part of it no matter what the conditions are. This is the main trail to access the main block. You can see it's a really nice red pine stand, which is for us is uncommon. It's a natural red pine, white pine mixed stand. We didn't really have much plans to do anything in here, where there's a wetland right here and one right here. So we're in this kind of narrow corridor in between the two wetlands. A lot of this is actually in the shoreland areas, the regulated shoreland areas, so we're limited on what we could do here. And what we used this for was basically to have a little bit of wood that was close by to the crossing, again for freezing that in. So last thing of the day, easy to get a hitch, small hitch, bring it across, work the trail a little bit. And that's what we did. So basically what I did from a marking standpoint here is we marked a little bit of the low quality hardwood, we marked a little bit of the aspen, some of the fir, just to get it out of the stand and use it really as part of our harvest planning, to be able to freeze the trail, to be able to have some brush available close by if we needed it. And I think that worked out pretty well, because if you've run cable skidder, you know sometimes the last hitch of the day, you don't want to go way the heck out to the back of the block. You want to cut a little bit of easy wood, not wade through the snow. So I think the logger liked that, to have a little bit just to finish it, round out the end of the day with an easy hitch of wood along the trail here. And that's basically what we use this area for. It was a little bit of an extension of the main trail, just to have some opportunity to help us implement the BMPs, help us implement the planning. And it never hurts to have a little bit of extra volume either for the logger. So we probably have about 10 acres on the other side in the safe wood area. The intermediate area is really just a couple of acres. I didn't even include it in my harvest acreage. And then probably 20 or 25 acres up in the next harvest block that we'll see. The wetlands, we have about a 10-acre wetland here and a 60-acre wetland over there. So those are the water resources we're working next to. Natural red pine is unusual on our land base. We have scattered onesie-twosies every once in a while, but we've got about a 30-acre pocket back here that has a significant percentage of red pine. Not completely sure with the stand history. There is charcoal in the soil, probably had a fire at some point back along, which may have encouraged it. And it's in a mixed stand. The harvest here, again, it was just along the trail to grab a little bit of extra hardwood. We're not going to regenerate red pine with a harvest like this. It's a very shade intolerant species. So thinking about it long term, might add some different management to encourage it. We've got another part of the stand we've done that in, but it is an interesting feature. It's kind of tucked back here out of the way, and it's sort of uncommon to have big red pine like this in this part of the world. Western Maine, there's places where you got a lot of red pine, but here in the lower Penobscot Valley, it's an interesting feature, and ones we like to find on the landscape and keep on the landscape if we can. We sold some very big red pine poles a few years ago from this stand. We sold actually a 67-foot pole, which is exceptional. You don't see many of that size. And selling red pine poles is interesting because there's some very particular specs that go with them, and it's fun to come out here with a pole buyer and see what they see and start to learn about that and watch them look up the tree and understand what they're looking for. So this is another one of our our pinch points are points that made the wood on this side riskier than over there on our same main trail system here. I'm standing between a couple of cedars. We have interrupted fern back there. Those are potential indicators of wet soils. And what we have here, if you dug down, you'd find this is kind of a peaty muck soil. So very susceptible to rutting, high saturated soil. So this is another one we had to pay attention to. And it continues over here where this arm of our main trail went. And what we did on this side of the trail is we packed a whole bunch of brush into there. You can see a lot of brush has been put in that trail. And we did that before we made the ruts because we knew otherwise we would make ruts. So we packed that side with brush for a couple of reasons. We were going to use that first, and it's also on a turn. And rutting is soils are more susceptible to rutting when you're turning the machinery. So we really put the BMPs into that. This trail here, we sort of have a short section here, maybe a couple hundred feet, where we have this peaty muck soil, and then we get onto a little bit better upland. So our strategy was with this one, we knew we were going to be here second. So we used a similar strategy as over here as we froze this, and we paid attention to freezing it. So when we packed this with brush, we just ran the skidder in here and mashed down the snow and ran over some fur. And then every once in a while, at the end of the day, we go grab a hitch of wood and start to work this trail and freeze it. So we actually didn't need the brush in here because we got the frost built into it really well. If we had some brush in reserve, some trees in reserve, if we needed the brush later on, we could have dragged them in, but we didn't need them. So kind of a two-pronged strategy, again, freezing and then frozen and brush over there, which seemed to work out pretty well. But the planting piece again was important. There's really no way around this. We're sandwiched right in between the two wetlands. Ideally, we try and avoid an area like this, but sometimes you can't because of the way your ownership lies or the way the water bodies lie. You got to cross these things sometimes, and they take a little more effort, but it's worth it because we didn't really have to shut down the operation to wait for them to dry out. We sort of planned it in and kept working and kept working. Again, we always had that wood on the other side in our back pocket. This stand was harvested about 12 years ago. It's a 3-stage shelterwood. So the first stage initiated the regeneration about 10 or 12 years ago. I don't remember the exact date. And this was stage 2 of the 3-stage shelterwood. So what we did was we removed about half of the overstory, still providing some high shade for weevil control and control of the other competing species. So removed about half of the overstory. There was still a bunch of hardwood in here, low quality hardwood. We don't grow very good hardwood here. So we cut the rest of the hardwood pulp, about 50,000 board feet of white pine, to give more light to the regeneration. The next step will be the overstory removal. We'll get this stuff up, another 10 feet or so. Remove the rest of the overstory except for some legacy trees that will be permanent reserves. So we'll pick some nice lunker pine out there, and they'll just stay there forever to provide some diversity in the stand. If we have some good wildlife trees out there, we'll maintain those, but that'll be the end of it, and then that'll be the final harvest, and we'll start the cycle again. The previous cut was with a mechanized system, cut the length system. This cut was with a cable skidder, and a careful logger who knows what they're doing with the cable skidder can release regeneration just fine. We'll probably come look at it in 5 years and see what it looks like, and then maybe another 10 years or so. We'll see how this stuff does, how it responds to the light. I think at that point we'll be thinking about, I think the pine that are here are pretty secure. We've controlled the competition around them. We've gotten rid of some fir, gotten rid of some of the stump sprouts. And what we'll be thinking about then is probably mostly maintaining forest health. So our big question is, when will we do our first spacing in here in that new stand? That's something that's kind of up for debate in pine when you do that, because you're balancing a lot of factors. You're balancing stem form, branch size, weevil, things like Caliciopsis canker, so you got a lot of things to juggle in that. So, you know, we won't space it right after we take the overstory off. We'll wait a little bit, but then we'll have to make a decision on when we'll do that first treatment. Will it be pre-commercial? Will it be commercial? And maybe for the next forester to figure out, because we deal with long time scales here in northern New England. So. I think planning is key, and flexibility is key. And communication is key. So it's always part of a team. Here I manage directly for the landowner, but oftentimes it's landowner, forester, logger that need to work as a team, understand the objectives, complete the task, understand the constraints that everyone's working with. The logger has to make a living, and they can't do everything we ask all the time, but there's ways to work together and manage the situation, plan well. Every site is different. This one had a lot of moving parts, and we had a lot of flexibility options, so just fully explore your site, fully explore the options, make use of every tool in the toolbox you can when you're planning risky wood and safe wood.